In this lesson, I'm going to talk about China's economical transformation of the past 40 to 50 years. As you will probably know, China is currently the second largest economy in the world. And it's probably a matter of time before it becomes the biggest economy in the world, considering that it has 1.4 billion citizens. But it hasn't always been this way. If you go back into the 1970s, China was still a very poor and mostly rural society. Most of the people were living in the countryside and just sort of maintaining small patches of land where they would grow some crops. But things changed dramatically. After the death of Mao Zedong, a new leader appeared on the Chinese stage, which was Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was a very pragmatic leader. What he did is he gave the economy more freedom and more reforms. First of all, he noticed that some farmers were actually selling some of their surplus crops on the free market. And he noticed that in these cases, these local economies did much better because these farmers had an incentive to actually work harder, grow more crops, because they could earn more money than the quotas they would normally have to provide. So he took this model and he made reforms in the Chinese economy, and he allowed farmers to sell their surplus crops on the free market. After this, there was also a wave of privatizations of many different types of state-owned enterprises, which were privatized, and a lot of the government officials actually became entrepreneurs, and this was another wave of booming growth. In 1980, Deng Xiaoping also created 4 special economic zones in the south of China, in Xiamen, Zhejiang, Zhuhai and Shantou. And in these special economic zones, he allowed foreign investment in, for instance, factories. And a lot of foreign companies, initially, especially from Hong Kong and from Taiwan, invested in setting up factories because the labor costs were so low in China. There was a lot of cheap labor, so it was interesting to manufacture products in China. Now, eventually, this further opening up created lots more investments from other countries, also from Europe and from the United States. And the country began to grow double-digit figures in the 1990s. And ever since, this has continued, and by now, China has lifted almost 800 million people out of poverty. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of things, why this and how this happened later in this lesson. But the important thing to actually realize, if you look at those last 40, 50 years, you will see that in this graph, China has gained a lot more market share as an economy in the world economy. So China has become much more important on the world stage. But what a lot of us might not know is that this is actually not something new, because until the end of the 18th century, China actually used to be the biggest economy in the world. But there were a couple of things that happened, and as you actually look at this picture, you can see that the first 1,000 years in this picture is actually compressed. So basically, countries like India and China, back in history, way back 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, used to be the biggest economy in the world. But something happened that made China lose its position. As you can see in this graph, the growth of the Chinese economy went down steeply during the 19th century. And also in the 20th century, things were not really improving. There were civil wars between the communists and the nationalists. And when the communists finally took over the country in 1949, and Mao Zedong became China's leader, there were a lot of quite disastrous policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And there was a great famine as well. So these things did not really help the economy during the 20th century. And it's only after Deng Xiaoping came to power and he had his reform and opening up policy I just talked about that the economy really improved. But the big question is, what happened back in the 18th century and in the 19th century that made China lose its world leading position? There's a couple of things that happened. One of the most important historical moments was a trade mission that Lord Macartney from the British court did to China, and he went to visit the Qianlong Emperor. There's a lot of different stories about this meeting. One of the interpretations of this meeting is that Macartney did not want to kowtow, like bow in a Chinese way for the Qianlong Emperor. And instead he greeted the emperor like he would greet his own king, by getting down on one knee and bowing his head. They then asked for trade, more openness and more trade with the Chinese economy, or with the Chinese country. But when he went back to Britain on his way back from leaving the country, they received a letter from the Qianlong Emperor saying that they were not interested in any products that the British had to offer to China. And they basically could do without their trade. Now, one interpretation of this event is that the British sort of insulted the Qianlong Emperor by not kowtowing, and that China was very much inward looking. Another interpretation, which has gained more ground more recently, is that it was not necessarily the kowtowing, that the Qianlong Emperor didn't really care about how he was greeted by the British, but it was other requirements that the British had for trade with China. They wanted the emperor to reduce trade tariffs. They also asked for several territories to actually hand over to the British for trade colonies. And they also asked for an ambassador to visit the emperor in the capital city, which was at that time not really common under the emperor's rule. So what story you believe has a lot of difference in how you interpret this event. The thing is that it's definitely not as simple as just saying that it's all about lack of kowtowing to the Chinese emperor. Regardless of which story you believe, the outcome was the same. Eventually, the British found something that the Chinese really wanted, and that was opium. So basically, the British became the drug dealers of the Chinese nation. And therefore, they found a way to sell things to the Chinese and trade with them. Eventually, the Chinese tried to force down this opium trade, and there was an incident where they broke open the crates of opium and just threw them in a harbor, and the British retaliated very forcefully, and this led to the first Opium War, and there was a second Opium War also in the 19th century. And this was even followed by a war with the French, a first war with the Japanese, and then again followed by a second war with the Japanese in the 20th century. There was a period of lots of repression by foreign forces, and it's what the Chinese call the start of the century of humiliation, like mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. And this is something that is still taught in Chinese classes to Chinese students, and is also used to sort of fire up a more patriotic feeling within the Chinese people. The century of humiliation. Now, this is quite important if you look at China today, because not only has China become a much more important economical power in the world with the arrival of Xi Jinping, there also came a moment where the Chinese leader said, this is the time for China to get back on the world stage and reclaim its truthful position as at least one of the major world leaders. Not necessarily the world leader, but they need to reclaim their truthful, their rightful position. And this is called the Chinese rejuvenation. So thinking back to the graph I showed you before, basically what's being said is we used to be one of the biggest ones, and we are getting back on the world stage and we're reclaiming our position. This is also called the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. So if you compare that to the American dream is much more about The individual can be whatever they want to be, theoretically, according to the American dream. But the Chinese dream is about the nation, all the people together, the rejuvenation of the nation. That's the Chinese dream. It's an important part of Xi Jinping's policy and his campaign. Another important part is the Belt and Road Initiative. So with the Silk Road, that was very important for Chinese trade in the back of their minds, they've created new trade routes overland and oversea to further improve the ways that China can do business with the rest of the world. Another important policy under Xi Jinping is Made in China 2025. Basically what this policy said is that in certain, especially technological sectors, China had to become self-sufficient and self-reliant and not depend on foreign countries anymore for a certain technology. And a target that was put on this policy was 70%. And some other countries interpreted this as protectionism for the Chinese market. So the Made in China 2025 was not received very well by, for instance, the United States. So, but it is something that is an important part of the Chinese strategy. And even though you won't hear it as much anymore in the Chinese political policies, it's mostly been replaced by something that they call dual circulation. And dual circulation stresses more the need for two kinds of trade. One is that China needs to become more self-sufficient and needs to focus more on the domestic market. So Chinese people manufacturing products and also providing services for the Chinese people. So that's the internal market, but continuing to trade with foreign countries. So also buying and selling stuff to other countries, other companies around the world and other consumers around the world. So this is something that's called dual circulation. Even though it might sound a bit more friendly, it basically comes down to the fact that there will be more emphasis in China on domestic markets. Now, let's have a look at that poverty alleviation that we saw before, the almost 800 million people that have been lifted out of poverty. If you look at the GDP per capita, the gross domestic product per capita of a country, that is an indication of how wealthy, how well off a certain country is. Doesn't mean that every person actually gets this amount of money, but it says something about the prosperity in a country. And as you can see in this graph, ever since the 1990s, it's been increasing very steeply in China. And currently, the GDP per capita per citizen in China is more than $10,000. If you compare that to other emerging countries like Brazil and India in this graph, you can see that China over the last couple of decades has done much better, especially much better than India. But at the same time, even though China as a country and the Chinese people have become much more prosperous, it's still just a moderately prosperous country. There's countries that are much more prosperous, as you can see. They have a darker color in this graph. But there's also countries that are much less well off, especially, for instance, in Africa. So this is also what China has called a target to become a moderately prosperous society. And as far as the Communist Party is concerned, with the 100th anniversary of the party, this year in 2021, when we're recording this video, is also the moment that they actually became a moderately prosperous country and they have lifted so many people out of poverty. Now, one of the ways that they did this is by moving more people from the countryside into the cities. Urbanization has been a real big driver for Chinese prosperity. Also, of course, specifically at the eastern coast where all of the factories were located. So if you could move people there, the average income would go up. At the same time, China tried to prevent all of the people from the rural areas moving into the cities by implementing a system that they call hukou. And that hukou system basically binds your rights to the place that your mother was born. In practice, this means that a lot of Chinese people from the countryside go to work in the factories on the coast, but they will have to leave their children at home because the children cannot get education in a public school, only in a private school, and most of the migrant workers cannot really afford something like that. So the hukou system has prevented mass migration into the cities and regulating that, but has also created other problems with like a whole generation that grew up without their parents and only with their grandparents that are taking care of them in the countryside. As you can see in this graph, in 1980, less than 20% of the people were living in cities, whereas now it's more than 60%. So just let that sink in and imagine what that has caused in the cities around China. An enormous boom of building. And a figure that illustrates this very interestingly is that if you look at all of the concrete and cement that was used in China between 2011 and 2013, a period that I myself was also living in China, that's the amount of cement was more, the quantity of cement was more than what was used in America in the whole of the 20th century. So let that sink in and you get an idea of the scale and the scope of what was going on in China in the last 10 years. Now, the urban disposable income has gone up quite quickly. The rural income has also risen because a lot of migrant workers that work in the coast, in factories, are also sending a lot of income back home, but it's not rising as quickly as in the cities. And if you take into account that most of the people, 870 million actually, of the 1.4 billion people in China are living in smaller cities and in the countryside, you get an idea about how there's still like big differences between people in urbanized areas and in rural areas. A very interesting characteristic about prosperity in China concerns the question, who actually has money in this country? And it differs quite starkly from what you see in other countries. If you take an average Western country, you will see that young people don't have a lot of very high income. They're still studying, they might have built up some debt during their studies and they're paying that off when they get their first jobs. And then they slowly start building a career, and maybe when they're in their 40s, 50s, they reach like the maximum level of income that they will ever have in their lives. In China, that picture is very different. In China, it's mostly the young people that have the highest incomes. And that mostly has to do with the fact that they are quite well educated. If you look at their parents of people in their 20s or 30s, a lot of them grew up as teenagers in the years of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, when all of the universities in China were closed. It was only in the late 70s that these universities were opened again and people were able to go back to school and get an education. So the highest educated people are actually the younger generations, whereas a lot of the older generations are simply missing those skills, also because a lot of them were still living in the countryside and not in the cities as their children. So this is quite important also if you're selling products to China, that in some cases where you might have a target audience among the older generations in Western countries, you need to look for people that can spend and have a lot of disposable income among the younger Chinese. Another way of looking at Chinese prosperity is by looking at different income classes, how big they are and what their average income per year is. These are figures that were released a few years ago by the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics. And at that moment, about 50% of the citizens in China were rural workers. And they only earned $2,000 on average per year. So let that sink in, that's per year, not per month. $2,000. 30% of the population were migrant workers, people from rural areas that went to the cities to work in factories or to work as a waiter or waitress or a cook or maybe a meal delivery or a courier for an e-commerce company. So these migrant workers on average earned $6,000 per year, $6,000 per year. Then you had 20%, which was considered to be middle class in China. And even though they are middle class, don't make any illusions about how much money they are earning in China, because it was only about $1,000 on average per month, so 12,000 per year. And then you had a very small group of people, less than 1% of the population, the upper class, and they were earning on average $500,000 per year. So you can see that some people in China got extremely rich. This has created a bit of a problem, and you might be familiar with something called the Genie Coefficient. And the Genie Coefficient basically tells you how the wealth is divided in a specific country. And in China, the Genie Coefficient is currently almost like 0.5. Now, if it's zero, if the coefficient is zero, then it means that everybody basically has the same share in all of the wealth in the country. Whereas if it's 1, then all of the wealth is concentrated with a very small group of people. Now, in countries where the Gini coefficient reaches 0.5, you see a lot of problems occurring, like civil wars, like strikes, a lot of violence and criminal behavior. And this is something that China is also, of course, trying to prevent. So it was Premier Li Keqiang that recently said that even though 800 million people were lifted out of poverty, and basically China considers poverty to be history, there are still some 600 million people in China that barely earn 1,000 yuan per month. And that's $143 or 134 euro in China. So basically what he's saying is we've reached a certain goal, but we've still got a long way to go. And if you follow the news in China in recent months, you might have heard the term common prosperity. So basically what China is trying to do now is they want to divide the wealth more equally among the people. That doesn't necessarily mean that there cannot be very rich people and there will remain some very poor people. But currently, as you can see in this graph, the society is shaped like a pyramid. And China basically wants it to be shaped like an olive, with most of the wealth in the middle and only very few people that are extremely rich or extremely poor. So this is something that you will hear more about probably in the news and will mostly drive the political policies in the years to come. So what we've seen is that China has become much more prosperous and the Chinese disposable income has risen quite starkly over the last couple of decades. But the question remains, does this actually make the Chinese people more happy? There's a report that is being released every couple of years called the World Happiness Report. And what we see in this report is different countries being ranked with a happiness score. And this score is normally based on things like your disposable income or GDP per capita, healthcare, corruption, etc., etc. And China has currently a score of, is ranked as the 84th country in the world. So it's somewhere in the middle among very happy countries and very unhappy countries based on these characteristics. But more interesting is if you look at the development over the last years, and then you'll see that even though the average Chinese person has much more disposable income and is much more wealthy than before, is at least not poor anymore, it doesn't necessarily make them extremely more happy. So there's some reasons for this sort of stable, not happy, not being unhappy situation in China. So this report raises the question, why have Chinese people become more prosperous and wealthy, but not happier than before? At least not significantly happier than before. And that is because the pressure on Chinese people has also increased quite a lot. If you currently ask the people around the world the question, do you feel under a lot of pressure to make money and be successful? China is the country with the highest number of respondents that says, yes, I feel that pressure. And also in China, people much more measure their success by the things they own. So the feeling of materialism is much stronger in China. This is also driven by the Chinese culture that if you can show off your wealth and your success, it gains you a lot of face, a lot of respect. So in China, the lack of increased happiness has to do with the overall pressure and the stress that they are under. Consider this. As a young Chinese teenager, you need to study very hard for the Gaokao, the Chinese college entrance exam. Because one difference in score on a Gaokao can mean a difference between a very good education and thereby a successful life, or being a failure in society. Then when you graduate from university, you're not the only one, and there's a lot of competition for the best jobs, and some people end up being unemployed for a while or being employed in a job for which they are actually highly overqualified. Then the cost of housing, if they have to get their own house either by renting it or by buying it, are very high, and also the cost of raising kids are quite high. Quite often young people have to work very long days in a very pressured working culture. And sometimes their bosses are not the kindest persons in the world, and they have to do sometimes quite mind-numbing work. And the society as a whole is very competitive. There's also a problem with loneliness in China. There's a lot of singles, especially single men, that cannot find a wife because of selective abortions under the one-child policy. And there's a lot of left-behind children in the countrysides that grow up with their grandparents while their parents are working at the coastal cities in the factories and such. Then there is a lot of pressure from society, and especially from your parents, to get married probably as soon as possible as you leave university and have children. And a lot of Chinese people don't necessarily want to get married and have children, especially young women also want to have a successful career before they think about having kids and being married. So there's a lot of pressure about that. And sometimes this pressure leads them to go into a relationship and get married, and there are cases of domestic violence and a lot of divorces. The divorce rates in China are skyrocketing. And then there's the cost of raising children. Because, again, the new generation also has to fight for that high score in the Gaokao. So you try to get a house close to a very good school, which is very expensive. And you're also spending a lot on education for your kids. And that's one of the reasons why the government has recently, in 2021, been cracking down on after-school tutoring. Because the costs are just getting too high for parents, and they decide not to have a second child. Whereas the country is sort of facing labor shortages in the coming decades. So the Chinese people basically all have also healthcare insurance, but if you get really sick, it doesn't really cover all of the costs, and you might have to depend on your family to actually pay for your healthcare. This puts extra pressure on the whole family. So it's basically these things that make Chinese life very, very hard compared to living in some of the other countries that score better on the World Happiness Report. But at the same time, this is about the individual. But if you go back and you think about the rejuvenation, the Chinese dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and you ask the Chinese people, do you think that your country is doing very well? Is going in the right direction? There's no other country in the world that scores as high as China. So people have confidence in the current path of their progress, of their country. And as a matter of fact, if you ask the people if they are really satisfied with their government, some people might find this hard to believe, but on average, Chinese people are very, very satisfied with the central government. In 2003, already 86% of the people said they were satisfied with the central government. And in 2016, Harvard found that this had risen to 93%. And I think that probably under COVID, with the government showing very strict rules and being much more successful in keeping COVID out of the country than a lot of other countries, and keeping the number of deaths caused by COVID down, the Chinese people have gained even more satisfaction and trust in their own government. At the same time, they might not be as satisfied with local governments, but overall the Chinese government, the central Chinese government, has got a lot of respect from the people. So not only are the Chinese people very satisfied with their central government, there's also a strong national pride about what the country has accomplished over the last couple of decades. And all of this pride came pouring out in 2019 when the People's Republic celebrated the 70th anniversary since its founding. And you could see all of the fireworks, and you could see the parades, and you could see people just cheering and being very proud. And if you watch TV, you might think, this is all just something that is staged. I was in Hangzhou at that specific moment, at this moment in time, and I could see that this is really truly the pride that the Chinese people feel. So as such, it will be very interesting to see where the Chinese dream goes in the next couple of decades and what happens to the Chinese country and the Chinese people. And I'll hope that you'll also be very interested to watch this development together with me. Now, I hope this lesson was interesting to you, you found it useful, and I will see you soon on another lesson. Thank you.